The sun was trying to kill everything that afternoon. Nora Callum saw him from the fence line, a dark shape against the white-hot distance, moving the way dying things move, slow and without direction. As though the earth itself had grown tired of holding him up. She had been mending wire when the shape resolved itself into a man. Old. Broad through the shoulders but caved in at the chest, like a barn that had lost its center post. His horse was gone. His hat was gone. The desert had taken both and left him this far and no farther. She dropped the wire pliers into the dirt and ran. The land between her fence and where he'd fallen was cracked clay and brittlebush, the kind of ground that gave nothing back. By the time she reached him, he had gone to his knees. His hands were pressed flat against the earth as though he was trying to feel something alive beneath it. His face was the color of old saddle leather left too long in the sun, deep lines, cracked lips, eyes that had gone half-closed against the white glare. "Mister." She crouched beside him and pressed her canteen to his mouth. "Drink slow. Do it slow or you'll be sick." He drank the way a man drinks who has made peace with never drinking again, careful, disbelieving, grateful beyond what words allow. "How long?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes were pale grey, and even bleached by the sun and half-blind with heat, they held a particular quality, not desperation, but something older. Recognition, maybe, of a kindness he had not expected to find in such a place. "Since yesterday morning," he rasped. Nora Callum was 26 years old, carrying a ranch that had been her father's and her father's father's, and she had not had an easy month in the past 3 years. But she put one arm under his and started walking him home, and she did not ask another question until she had him inside. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The Callum Ranch sat in a shallow bowl between two ridges, the kind of land that looked modest from a distance and revealed its hardship only when you lived on it. The house was pine plank construction, weathered to the color of ash, with a porch that sagged on the left side where a support post had been replaced with a flat stone and never properly fixed. The barn was sounder than the house. Nora had made sure of that, because the barn held what was left of the cattle operation, 11 head, a mule named Patience, and 30 bales of hay she had cut herself. Inside the house, the signs of a woman running things alone were everywhere and unashamed. A stack of unfolded laundry on the bench by the door. Harness leather coiled on the kitchen table where there was better light than in the barn. A rifle hung on 2 nails above the window, and the window itself had a crack sealed with dried pine resin that had gone dark amber with age. The dishes were clean and stacked. The floor had been swept recently enough that the dust had only begun its return along the baseboards. She got the old man into the chair by the stove, the good chair, the one with the back intact, and she pressed a wet cloth to the back of his neck and told him to stay put while she worked. He said his name was Elias Croft. He said it the way men of a certain age say their names, simply, like a fact that required no embellishment. "Nora Callum," she said, and went to the stove. She had not planned for company. She had planned for the same supper she'd been eating all week, dried beans, a heel of cornbread, and whatever was left of the smoked venison she'd hung in October. But she stood at that stove and she looked at the state of the man in her chair and she made a different decision. She went to the cellar. Down in the cool dark, she took stock, half a crock of lard, 2 jars of put-up tomatoes, a rope of dried onions, a sack of flour that was still good. She brought up what she needed and she went to work the way her mother had taught her, without ceremony, without waste. With the particular focused quiet of a woman who understood that food is not simply fuel. Food is argument against despair. Food is proof that tomorrow is still worth planning for. She rendered a portion of the lard in the iron skillet and let it go clear before she set the onions in. They softened slow, going translucent, then gold at the edges, filling the house with a smell that made something loosen in the air. She opened one of the tomato jars and poured it over, broke it up with a wooden spoon that had been her grandmother's, added a handful of dried chili and a measure of salt. She cut the last of the venison thin and set it to braise in the liquid. While that worked, she mixed a pan of biscuits, not the thin emergency kind, but proper biscuits, cut with the tin ring. Set close together in the cast iron so they'd rise against each other and come out soft in the middle. Elias Croft did not speak while she cooked. He watched the room instead, and what he saw he catalogued quietly: the crack in the window, the sagging porch visible through the glass, the single woman's boot drying by the door. The absence of any man's coat on the hooks by the entry. A saddle blanket on the back of a chair that had been mended in 3 places with different thread. He said nothing about any of it. He drank the water she kept refilling without being asked. When the food was ready, she set it on the table and moved the harness leather to the floor without comment. He ate slowly at first, the way a man who has been without food too long must eat, with discipline, reining himself back. Then the braise hit him properly, the fat and the acid of the tomato and the deep smoke of the venison, and something in his posture changed. The caved-in quality began to ease. His shoulders settled differently. He tore a biscuit apart and the steam rose from it, and he held it a moment before he ate it, like a man in a church he had not entered in many years. "This is a fine supper," he said. "It's what there was," she said, but not dismissively. "Honestly." "Where are your people?" he asked. She kept her eyes on her plate. "Gone," she said. Just that. Just the one word, and she left it standing in the room, and he understood enough not to push at it. He slept that night on the narrow cot in the back room that had once been her younger brother's. She made it up with a clean quilt and put a candle on the shelf and left him to it. She sat up another hour herself, mending the harness by lamplight, listening to the sound of another person breathing in her house, a sound so foreign to her now that it was almost disturbing. Like a clock begun after a long silence. She was not certain what the morning would bring. She did not examine that uncertainty too closely. She only knew that she had done what a decent person does, and that the desert had been asking her for 3 years to become indecent, and she had not yet complied. Elias Croft was up before her. She found him on the sagging left end of the porch, not sitting but standing, looking at the post and the stone beneath it with the particular expression of a man taking a measurement in his head. He had found, she noted, the hammer she kept in the catch-all box by the door. "You shouldn't be on your feet yet," she said. "I've been horizontal long enough," he said. He looked at the post. "You got a spare 6x6 in that barn?" "Half of one." "That'll do." She watched him for a moment. There was something in the economy of his movements, deliberate but not slow, considered but not hesitant, that told her he had been a working man all his life. Not a man who gave orders. A man who did the work himself. "Coffee first," she said. "Yes, They drank coffee on the functional end of the porch and watched the morning come in over the east ridge. The light arrived in layers, first a thinning of the dark, then a pewter grey. Then the ridge lit up the colour of hammered copper before the full force of the sun cleared the rock and turned everything hard-edged and brilliant. A roadrunner crossed the yard at speed, purposeful as a thought, and disappeared into the brush. "How long have you run this place alone?" Elias asked. 2 years, 8 months, she said. She had not counted it precisely before, but it came out of her already counted. He nodded. He did not offer sympathy. She was grateful for that. She set him to fixing the porch post, not because she couldn't have done it, but because she recognized that a man who had nearly died in the desert the day before needed the dignity of usefulness. She went to her own work, mucking out the 2 occupied stalls, breaking a bale for the cattle, checking the water line to the stock tank where the coupling had a slow weep she'd been monitoring. From across the yard, she could hear him working. The sound of a hammer in the morning. She had not heard it in a long time. She told herself it was merely useful information, a task being completed, and not the thing it actually was, which was the sound of something lonely becoming slightly less so. By noon the post was set properly and he'd looked at the window crack besides, mixing a small amount of clay from the yard with a bit of pine resin she had in a tin. Working it into the gap with a patience that was almost meditative. The window would not be pretty, but it would not admit the winter cold any longer in that particular place. She made him rest in the afternoon. He argued briefly and capitulated without much genuine resistance, which told her his body was overriding his pride, which meant he was still weaker than he appeared. 40 miles east, in the town of Brickett's Crossing, a man named Cyrus Wald was reading a letter. He sat in the back office of the Land Assay building, a position he had arranged for himself 3 years prior by the simple mechanism of patience and connection and a willingness to do favors that other men would not do. Cyrus Wald was not large or physically imposing. He had a narrow face and hands that he kept clean, and he dressed in the manner of a man who wished to be taken for a professional when he was, in fact, something older and less forgiving. The letter was from a contact in Reyes County, a clerk in the land office there who understood his value and Wald's gratitude, which came in the form of folded bills delivered quarterly. The letter informed him that a notice of tax delinquency had been filed on the Callum Ranch property. The amount was not large. That was not the point. The point was the window it opened. Cyrus Wald set the letter flat on the desk and aligned its edges precisely with the desk's edge. Then he called for his associate, a wide man named Dooley, who stood by doors and said little but understood instructions the first time they were given. "Ride out toward the Callum spread," Wald said. "Have a look. Tell me what you see." Dooley put on his hat and left without a word. Wald looked at the letter again. 3 years he had been patient. He had watched the Callum property from a careful distance, letting the land do what the land did when there wasn't enough labor or money to hold it against time. Let it fray, let it diminish. Let the woman inside it grow exhausted enough that the legal pressure of a tax bill would tip her toward selling, and selling cheap, because a tired woman alone has fewer options than she ought. He had not reckoned for a complication. He did not yet know there was one. But 40 miles west, on a porch with a new post and a sealed window, Elias Croft was watching the horizon with pale grey eyes that had seen trouble in many forms and in many territories. And he was beginning to have a feeling he recognized. On the third day, Nora had to go into Reyes. She needed flour, salt, lamp oil, and a replacement buckle for the mule's breast collar that had cracked during the last haul. She had also received, in the prior week's post that she'd collected but not yet opened, an envelope from the county land office, a thing she had been avoiding the way a person avoids the last conversation before a hard parting. She opened it the night before the supply run, sitting alone at the kitchen table. The number inside was not catastrophic by itself, but situated against what she had in the tin box under the floorboard, and she knew that number with a precision born of anxiety. It was enough to matter. $47 in back property tax. Due within 60 days or the county would begin proceedings. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in its envelope, and placed it on the table where she could see it. Then she went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours constructing and discarding plans. Elias found her at the table in the morning with the envelope beside her coffee cup. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her and waited, because he had learned in the last 2 days that this was a woman who spoke when she was ready and not before. She slid the envelope toward him. He read it, set it down. "How far are you short?" $32, she said. "If I sell 2 of the cattle, maybe 3. Selling breeding stock." "I know what it is," she said, without sharpness, but with finality. "Let me ride to town with you." She looked at him. He had color back now, and had found in the barn a spare razor and a bar of brown soap, and had addressed himself accordingly. He looked, in the morning light, like what she suspected he actually was, a man of substance who had recently experienced a catastrophe, the nature of which he had not yet disclosed. "You're in no shape to. I rode for 30 years, he said. "I can manage the mule." She almost smiled. "That mule will test your patience." "I have been tested," he said simply. They went to Reyes in the wagon, Elias handling patience with the quiet authority of a man who understood animals. Nora sitting straight back beside him with her list in her coat pocket and the tax envelope tucked against her side. Reyes was 12 miles in and 40 years old, and it showed both. The main street was packed dirt with boardwalks on the mercantile side and packed dirt on the other. The water trough in front of the livery needed cleaning. 3 men sat in front of the hotel doing the work that idle men do, which is primarily observation. Nora went to the mercantile first. Harriet Som ran the mercantile with her husband's name above the door and her own hand in everything beneath the roof. She was 60, spare, precise in her opinions and generous with them. She watched Nora come through the door and then watched Elias come through behind her, and her expression moved through several calculations in approximately 1 second. "Nora," she said. "Morning, Harriet. I need the usual order and a brass buckle, number 4, if you've got it." "I've got it." Harriet's eyes tracked to Elias, who was examining a display of hoof picks near the door with apparent genuine interest. "Who's this you brought?" "Elias Croft. He was stranded out on the flats 3 days ago. I took him in." "Took him in," Harriet repeated, in a tone that contained a paragraph. "He needed water and a meal and a place to sleep," Nora said, meeting the woman's eyes without aggression and without apology. "I provided those things. Same as anyone decent would." "Folks will talk," Harriet said, quietly, not unkindly, but talking nonetheless. "Folks talked when I kept the ranch after my father died," Nora said. "They talked when I refused to sell to the walled interests last year. I expect they'll manage to talk about this too, and the sun will still come up." Harriet pulled the buckle from a drawer and set it on the counter. Her expression had shifted slightly, not into approval, exactly, but into something adjacent to respect. From across the store, Elias had apparently heard enough of this exchange to form an opinion. He came to the counter and put out his hand to Harriet. "Elias Croft. Late of the Colorado Territory, before that the Cimarron. I appreciate Miss Callum's hospitality and her defense of it." Harriet shook his hand and looked at him more carefully, the way she looked at ledger numbers, reading what was there against what was claimed. "You have the hands of a rancher," she said. "I was one," he said. "Until recently." Something about the plainness of that statement closed the inquiry. Harriet began pulling Nora's order together. The trouble came from a different quarter. Garrett Pell was the county land agent, not Cyrus Wald, but adjacent to him in the way that useful officials often are adjacent to men of influence, held there by debt or ambition or both. He was 40, with a neat small mustache and the manner of a man who had practiced reasonableness until it had become a kind of weapon. He found them at the wagon while they were loading. "Nora Callum," he said, pleasantly. "I see you got the notice." "I did," she said. 60 days is generous," he said. "But I want you to know, there are options available. Mr. Wald has expressed an ongoing interest in the property, and given the circumstances are 60 days, she said. "I don't need more than that." Pell's gaze moved to Elias, who was tying off the last of the load. The gaze was the kind that takes stock and draws conclusions. "And who is this?" "A friend," Nora said. "A friend," Pell said, in the same tone Harriet had used but with a different purpose. "You understand, people are all ready. The county seat has standards regarding." Elias Croft stepped down from the wagon bed and stood beside Nora. He did not square up or threaten or raise his voice. He simply stood there, at his full height, with his pale grey eyes on Garrett Pell, and he said, "I believe Miss Callum has answered your question." Pell blinked. He was a man who was accustomed to being the one making the silence uncomfortable, and he found himself, briefly, without a functional reply. He recovered. 60 days, he said, and walked away. Nora released a breath she had been holding since he'd said her name. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Elias climbed up beside her. Patient stood with the patient suffering of a mule who had been waiting longer than she considered reasonable. Neither Nora nor Elias spoke for the first 2 miles. Then Nora said, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You stood there," she said. "Sometimes that's the whole of it." It was Dooley who came first, which was how Cyrus Wald operated: test the ground with a heavy foot before you step onto it. He came on the 5th night. Nora woke to patients making a sustained, low complaint from the barn, not a frightened sound, but an annoyed one. The sound a mule makes when something has entered a space where it believes it has prior claim. She lay still in her bed for 3 full seconds, listening, categorizing. The house was dark. The clock on the shelf said 2:15. She took the rifle from above the window before she had fully made the decision to do so. The porch was silver and black in the half-moon, and she moved along the wall to the edge of the front door and looked through the narrow glass beside it without putting her face in the opening. The yard was still. The barn door was as she'd left it, angled open 6 inches. But Patience was still talking. From the back room, Elias's voice, barely above a whisper, I heard it. The barn, she said. A long pause. Then the sound of him dressing quickly in the dark. She had a system for nights like this, though it was a system she'd built alone, never having used it with another person present. She went through the kitchen, slipped out the side door that opened onto the vegetable garden, and worked her way along the garden fence to the rear corner of the barn. The ground there was soft from a recent watering and she moved on it without sound. The barn's rear window was oilskin covered, not glass. She pressed her ear to the frame. Breathing. One set. Heavy. Someone standing still and listening, the way a man listens when he thinks he's been heard. She went around the corner and put her back to the barn wall and waited. Elias had gone around the other side. She knew this because she heard nothing from his direction, which meant he was doing it right. The barn door moved. The 6-inch gap became a foot. A large shape emerged from it, paused, began to orient itself to the dark yard. Nora stepped out from the wall. I have a Winchester and I know how to use it, she said. Your business would be stating yours. The shape stopped. A voice came out of it, thick, without particular emotion, just passing through, miss. Nobody passes through at 2 in the morning through a closed barn, she said. Elias had come around the far corner, and he said nothing, but the shape, Dooley, big as a cob stove and about as communicative, became aware of him. The awareness registered in the posture, a stiffening, a calculation. You'll walk off this property now, Nora said. You'll leave the way you came in, and you'll tell whoever sent you that this land is occupied and defended and not for sale at any price. Another pause, longer this time. While Dooley weighed the economics of the situation. Then he walked. Across the yard and through the gate and into the dark road, and the sound of his boots on the hardpan diminished and was gone. Nora lowered the rifle. She was trembling slightly, not from fear, she recognized, but from the release of concentrated attention. She stood in the yard in the half-dark with the rifle at her side and breathed. Elias came and stood beside her. He did not put a hand on her shoulder or say that everything would be fine, because he was a man who understood that such gestures, offered to a woman who had just held her own against a trespasser in the dark, would be a diminishment rather than a comfort. Walled, he said. Almost certainly, she said. Then he's close to making a move. She looked at him. In the moon-thin light his face was angular and grave. You know him. I know his kind, Elias said. I've been knowing his kind since before you were born, and I have been, in the past, insufficiently prepared. He paused. I do not intend to be again. They went inside. She made coffee because neither of them was going back to sleep. They sat at the kitchen table in the small circle of lamplight, the rifle on the table between them, and Elias Croft began, for the first time, in slow, measured sentences, to tell her who he was. He had owned 1,100 acres in the Colorado Territory. A cattle operation. Good land, good water, well managed. He had been in his 60s, a widower, running it with hired hands. A man named Reese, different name, same operation as Wald, had begun buying the surrounding parcels, pressuring his water rights, filing nuisance liens. Elias had fought it in the county court for 2 years and won twice. Then Reese had acquired the judge. The third filing had gone against him. The ranch had been attached. The hired hands had been gone by the time he understood what was happening, and he had ridden south with what he could carry, and his horse had gone lame on the second day. And he had walked until he had not been able to walk any farther. Nora listened without interruption until he was finished. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because it was my trouble," he said. "Not yours." "It's mine now," she said. Not as an accusation. As a statement of fact, plain and final, the same way she said most things. He looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said. "I believe it is." She nodded. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Outside, a coyote spoke once to the dark and was quiet again. "What do we do?" she said. Elias Croft put his elbows on the table. "First thing," he said, "is we take away the thing he's using for a handle." In the morning, Elias wrote 2 letters. He wrote them at the kitchen table with the pen and the bottle of ink Nora kept in the desk drawer, and he wrote them in the clear, looping hand of a man who had once signed many documents and understood the weight of ink on paper. The first letter was addressed to a man named Samuel Haight, attorney, in Santa Fe. The second was addressed to a man named R. Connell, who held a position at the Territorial Land Office that Elias described only as useful. He sealed them, handed them to Nora. "These need to go by the next post out of Reyes, earliest possible." "What do they say?" "The first asks Samuel to send a copy of my original Colorado title documentation. I retained copies with him against such a contingency." He paused, with the briefest expression of a man acknowledging his own prior wisdom. "The second asks Connell to pull the filing history on this property back 20 years and look for any irregularities in the tax assessment chain." Nora looked at the sealed envelopes. "You think there are irregularities?" "I think a man like Wall does not accumulate land without help, and help of that kind generally leaves marks if someone knows where to press." He stood, poured himself coffee, stood at the window looking at the new day. "A man who does things clean doesn't need to send someone to your barn at 2 in the morning. A man who does things clean goes to the courthouse and lets the paperwork do the work. Wall doesn't do things clean. Which means his paperwork, on examination, is not clean either." She sent the letters that afternoon. Then she did what Elias suggested next. She went to see Harriet Somm. Harriet Somm had been in Reyes County for 31 years. She had buried a husband, raised 2 sons who had gone to other territories, and maintained the mercantile through drought years and flood years and the particular ongoing difficulty of making a living in a place that was actively trying to prevent it. She was not a woman given to sentiment, but she was given to fairness, and what amounted to the same thing in practical terms. She remembered what she had seen. And she talked to the people who mattered. Nora came to her without preamble. She sat in the chair by the stove in the back of the mercantile, the chair where Harriet conducted the conversations that were not for public consumption, and she laid out what she knew. The tax notice. The visit to the barn. Elias Croft's history in Colorado. Garrett Pell's proximity to Wald's interests. Harriet listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on the floor. When Nora finished, she uncrossed her arms. "I knew your father," she said. "That land has been Callum land since before Reyes was a town. I have watched Wald position himself around this county for 4 years, and I have been waiting for someone to put it plain." "I am putting it plain," Nora said. "Who is Croft, actually?" Harriet asked. "Not the story. The man. A man who lost his property to the same type of scheme," Nora said. "And who has, it appears, considerably more resources and knowledge than he looks like at present." Harriet considered this. "There are 4 people in this county whose opinion others follow," she said. "I am one. Reverend Aldis is another. The third is Doc Ferris, who delivered every child in the valley for 15 years. The fourth is James Bright, who owns the livery and half the water contracts." She stood up. "I think it is time for a conversation." "I was hoping you'd say that," Nora said. The response from Samuel Haight arrived in 11 days, faster than either of them had expected, and the envelope was thick. The response from Connell arrived 4 days after, and it was thinner but more pointed. Elias read both at the kitchen table and set them down with the particular stillness of a man who has received news he had hoped for but had not been certain of. The tax assessment on your property, he said, was recalculated upward 3 years ago by an amended filing that was never served to you directly. The amendment bears Pell's signature and was filed 6 weeks after Wald's most recent offer to purchase was refused. He looked at her steadily. It's not legal. The service of process was defective. And the assessment itself appears to have been calculated against an incorrect parcel boundary, one that shows your acreage 30% larger than the recorded survey. Nora absorbed this. Meaning the tax bill is fraudulent. Fraudulent, or at minimum, willfully erroneous. Which in a court of law with Samuel Haight arguing the case amounts to the same remedy. He placed his hands flat on the envelopes. But there is more. The Colorado documentation showed not only Elias's prior ownership but a specific pattern. Reese in Colorado and Wald in New Mexico territory shared a silent financial partner, a land investment concern out of Kansas City that had been involved in 6 similar acquisitions in 4 territories over 8 years. 3 of them had faced the same defective tax assessment method. It was, as Elias put it to Nora that evening, a pattern. And patterns, once documented and placed in front of the right people, became evidence. Evidence became liability. And men like Wald, who depended on the quiet of their operations, do not survive liability made public. Harriet Somm had her conversation. Then Reverend Aldous spoke from the pulpit on Sunday, not naming names, but speaking plainly about the sin of using legal machinery to dispossess a widow or an orphan of their rightful inheritance. The language old and familiar, the application unmistakable in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. Doc Ferris wrote a letter to the territorial capital. James Bright called in a debt from a man on the county commission. Garrett Pell, facing the retraction of social credit that was the only actual currency he'd ever possessed, amended his records. The corrected assessment showed Nora Callum owed $11 in back taxes, an amount she paid in cash from the tin box under the floorboard. And she stood at the courthouse window and watched the clerk stamp satisfied across the top and felt something in her chest that she had not felt in 3 years. Cyrus Wald did not leave Brickett's Crossing immediately. Men of his type rarely acknowledge the wall until they've run into it at speed. But the Kansas City investment concern, faced with the documentation Samuel Haight had now formally submitted to the Territorial Attorney General's office, withdrew its support from Wald's regional operations. Without that backing, Wald's leverage on Pell became worthless. Without Pell, his access to the assessment process was closed. He was, in the language of the range, a bull without pasture. He left in late November, quietly, on an early morning stage, and nobody in Reyes County watched him go, which was, in its own way, the most complete defeat possible. The question of Elias Croft's situation had run alongside all of this, parallel and quieter. He had not asked to stay. He had not made claims or requests. He had done the work that presented itself each day, the porch, the window, the broken gate latch. The waterline coupling that he fixed properly with a new fitting he brought back from Reyes in his coat pocket. He had risen early and gone to bed late and eaten what was put before him and said thank you for each meal with the same sincerity he'd said it for the first one. On the day Nora came back from the courthouse with the stamped receipt, she found him in the barn. He was repairing the breast collar, the new buckle set, the leather cleaned and oiled, the stitching reinforced along a section that had been weakening for 2 seasons. Patience stood watching him with the philosophical expression of a mule who had decided to withhold judgment. Nora stood in the barn door with the receipt in her hand. "It's done," she said. He looked up from the collar. He read her face and he read the paper and he let out a breath that he had, she realized, been holding for 11 days. "Good," he said. "Just that." She folded the receipt and put it in her pocket. She looked at the collar in his hands. She looked at the barn, at the swept floor, the organized tack wall, the rehung lantern bracket that had been pulled half off the beam for a year. "You've been making yourself useful," she said. "Seemed the right thing to do," he said. "I've been thinking," she said. The words were careful, the way her words always were. She was not a woman who spoke without having thought first. This ranch needs more than one pair of hands. It always has. My father ran it with 3 hired men and still he was stretched thin. She paused. I have a proposition. He set the collar on the rail and gave her his attention. A partnership, she said. Legal and documented. Your name on the deed alongside mine, not as a gift, but as consideration for your labor and your knowledge and what you've already put in here. She kept her eyes on his. Samuel Haight can draw it. Equal shares, equal decisions, equal standing. No other arrangement would be proper. The word proper sat in the air with a specific weight. She had chosen it deliberately because she understood the difference between what the town would accept and what was right. And she had decided that in this case they would have to find a way to be the same. Elias Croft was quiet for a long moment. In the Colorado Territory, he had built something and had it taken. He understood now, with a precision he had not possessed before, exactly what it cost. And he understood. Looking at this woman in the doorway of her barn with a courthouse receipt in her pocket and a rifle over her shoulder and the particular straightness of someone who has stood alone for too long and learned to make it work. Exactly what she was offering and why. That's a fair proposition, he said. I intend it to be, she said. Patience shook her large head as though offering an opinion. Neither of them disagreed. The deed was drawn in December, witnessed by Harriet Somm and Reverend Aldous, and filed without incident at the county courthouse where a stamped receipt now lived in the same drawer as the first one. By spring, there were 22 head of cattle on the Callum Croft property, and the porch stood level, and the window was glass now instead of oilskin. And there was a second pair of boots drying by the door. Nora Callum had seen, in the past 3 years, what the world does to things left undefended, how it picks at the edges, tests the weak places, finds the crack in the glass and works at it until the whole pane gives. She had learned to shore up. She had learned to hold. But there is a kind of holding that hollows a person. A grip so tight and so long that the hands forget what it was like to open. What she had not known, what the desert had delivered to her door in the form of a sun-wrecked old man who asked for a drink of water and ended up fixing everything that was broken, was that there is also a different kind of strength. Not the strength of holding alone, but the strength of 2 people standing in the same yard, reading the same horizon, and deciding together that this land is worth every single thing it takes. The land does not care who saved it. It only remembers who stayed. And the Callum land remembered. The hardpan cracked and bloomed in March the way it always did, reluctant and extravagant and unexpectedly beautiful. The way things do when they are given just enough of what they needed, nothing more, nothing less, at exactly the right time.